So I'm in this particular situation where I'm watching Jordan Peterson's fandom kind of like melt into the kind of woodwork of Dr. Oz and the usual pseudoscience that much of middle America already consumes. And I realized that already the sort of like epistemic conditions of workers, their educational circumstances, we think of education as the production of individuals who have some framework of the world around them has always been disintegrated. And it's very hard to tell like relative regressions. Was Jordan Peterson really that new? Not really, we've always had snake oil salesmen, etc. But I'm just looking down the road, what's going to come after like the IDW, the intellectual dark web, and I'm just like dreading it. Because like since like 2012, I've been like trying to ignore the fandom of Sam Harris and thinking like, oh, this is just normal, but perhaps we shouldn't take our own epistemic and educational conditions for granted. So with that sense of dread for the future, I'm going to go to the paper. So I urge, we must produce a new materialist education. However, before I struggle against the cliches and doe-eyed idealism in this proclamation, let us survey the regression of public discourse and the latest culmination of history in the person of Dr. Jordan Peterson. A decade after the 2008 recession, the field of economics and the wider public has hardly learned a thing about the cause of this catastrophe or what to do before the next one. Despite the growth of the Democratic Socialists of America and sporadic strikes, we have yet to see the emergence of a working class movement. As usual, the workers remain on the margins of the bourgeoisie's public discourse. Meanwhile, the digital spectacle actively generates even more insane delusions, left, right, and center. Recently, several notable and clippable figures of the professional classes rebelled against professionals by suggesting better people in the right spots. And the proposal that public bureaucracies, such as universities, need to be reformed by or replaced by private bureaucracies due to curricula and cost-cutting measures. I believe Dr. Jordan Peterson had his finger on the pulse of our society when he suggested an online university. After all, with historically high tuition rates and an unpredictable economy, the student and future worker must adapt to social separation from their peers and receive guidance from the hierarchies of competency. But as Peterson explained in his books Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, a person must self-author themselves in a manner I would compare to a self-directed ballistic missile, cybernetically processing known and unknown, integrating order and chaos to arrive at a mystified, predestined target. A degree, a job, a relationship, a series of personal and private requirements confined to the tidy bourgeois living room, and the fantasies projected within. I applaud Peterson for his positive therapeutic effects among his audience, of course, and I sympathize with much of the fan base. However, workers should despise his worldview and the infernal system that produces this tunnel vision. Frankly, what characterizes the racing crop of liberal apologists is the narrowness of their vision. The poet William Blake already prophesied in the late 1700s of people like Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and the orgy of distinguished experts, left, right, and center, we have today. You see, Blake produced a satire of Enlightenment rationality in the character Urizen, as in your reason or your horizon. Urizen represented the rationalizing processes of the industrializing British Empire. Urizen binds, blinds, and mutilates himself with crass concepts, proliferating with imperial force across the globe. Since the 1700s, this figure of lonely self-delusion becomes familiar across society. The microsect, the impositions of identity right and left, the banalities of political media, state and corporate bureaucracies, and the ubiquitous private filter bubble that becomes a vanishing point of public discourse. Peterson's cybernetic neoliberal subject is not his own creation, but rather the product of a centuries-long process of the dismantling of working-class institutions and capitalist rationalization that follows soon after. Blake articulated a systemic irrationality endemic to our society, and his insights echo across the centuries. We all have a major problem. I frame this problem as a materialist education. I represent a small para-academic association called Slimy Clearing. Our goal is the production of research and education for workers. Slavoj Žižek said, "Don't act, just think." I argue we must act on behalf of thinking. We must embody thinking. Research programs, deliberation, and education. Am I going too long?
You're good.
Okay.
You're good. You're good.
All right. I argue we must act on behalf of thinking. We must embody thinking. Research programs, deliberation, and education are social and material practices, continuously under threat by... I'm missing a page. Continuously under threat by the dismantlement of public education, our media systems, and the bureaucratic impositions of schooling. Additionally, as Marxists, we should recognize that our existing institutions cannot produce a revolutionary working class, and in fact, act in ways to impede this task. A materialist education is a problem for the left to be produced, but the problem is also the working class's problem, even if this problem has rarely been posed to the workers. In this essay, I will elaborate a series of universal problems to be embodied. Karl Marx already posed these problems in the 1800s, and I follow the educator Bernard Stiegler in contextualizing these problems in the 21st century. These problems form the basis of the Slimy Clearing research program and must inform working class organizations in the future. What is at stake is nothing less than our subjectivity as individuals and collectives. Stiegler defined education as the co-individuation of individual I's and collective we's. If I and we are continuously individuating ourselves, then our education happens everywhere, in the school, the workplace, the public place, the home, even alone on our computers. This notion of lifelong learning carries a dystopian potential. We have the potential to disindividuate, to regress, to destroy ourselves. For example, I continuously learn of new and interesting ways to submit myself to both state and corporate bureaucracies for the sake of both real and imaginary jobs. And I received the impression that rural areas and cities are experiencing a social disintegration that is hard to grasp in the historical frame of our urban and rural development along the lines of capital. My personal capacity for disindividuation is directly related to the disindividuation of working class institutions. Individuation is a universal problem. Disindividuation undermines two central capacities of Enlightenment subjectivity. The first capacity, desire, is the coupling together of base drives of sex, aggression, and addiction into more sophisticated, sociable, and intelligent forms of care. Capitalism undermines the capacity of the workers to desire, that is, to think and act toward a better work, a better solidarity, and a better future for the generations. Woo! The second capacity, the giving of reasons, is the ability to account for oneself and reach common understandings in a common space. What is at stake for workers is nothing less than their subjectivity as desiring, thinking, and materially acting beings. Individuals are responsible for struggling against individual regression. But what agent is responsible for struggling against collective disindividuation, and what Stiegler calls bluntly collective stupidity? In his essay, in answer to the question, what is enlightenment, Immanuel Kant argued that a reading public could struggle against its self-induced immaturity. Karl Marx, while rigorously defending the liberties of the reading public, argued that the working class was responsible for maturing humanity by replacing the system of capitalism that induces mass immaturity. Yet the history of the working class as revolutionary subject has been a disaster of the disintegration of working class institutions. Workers today must struggle against two related processes from each other, producing a condition of interindividuality, where isolated persons look to an image of individuality or collectivity to conform to, such as the master race, the party, Stalin, the 1950s organization man, Peterson's organized individual man, the YouTube celebrity, etc. Stiegler developed this type of disindividuation from Marx's 1852 work, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Marx explained how the failure of the urban workers and rural peasants to organize collectively left the peasants as a mass of isolated patriarchal families. Stiegler called this task of collective organization transindividuation, the individuation of I's via we and a we via I's. The failure of transindividuation left the peasants regressed in a state of interindividuality. Because their form of labor and discourse left them isolated and solipsistic, peasants fell prey to primary narcissism and identified with the great Frenchman Louis Bonaparte. This resulted in an authoritarian government and the expansion of military bureaucracy to fill in the gaps of social isolation. Interestingly, if we conceive of the alienation of peasants and workers as a material problem and conceive of imaginary figures such as Louis Bonaparte or de Gaulle or other demagogues as the positive solution, then we have a rudimentary media theory. In 1967, Guy Debord described the spectacle as, quote, a social relation among people mediated by images. This spectacle is a form of interindividuality, where people incapable of coordinating with other people rely upon an external authority or media fantasy. The second related process of disindividuation occurs in the exteriorization of know-how by technology and bureaucracy. Marx explained how automation intensifies the division of labor and articulates workers as necessary but replaceable cogs on the periphery of a production line far beyond their comprehension or control. According to Stiegler, this automation of labor causes a loss of know-how and a loss of knowledge of how to live. However, Stiegler did not confine to the workplace the technological exteriorization of knowledge. In addition to the automation of the labor process, automation proliferates into the home, the schools, and the blurred private-public spheres. Previously, Kant warned against allowing a book or an expert to think for us. Unfortunately, since Kant, we have produced even more fascinating media regressions. Following I would assume there's a certain liberal tendency to think that we should follow like experts. We should actually obey the experts, like the people, the climate scientists, or we should actually read books. But we don't do either. We have moved on in our progress. Following Adorno and Horkheimer's analysis of the culture industry, Stiegler argued that the attention economy fragments our desires into base drives. It is not surprising that Stormy Daniels' Trump affair has received more media coverage than the war in Yemen. This is partly because news media is simply a different genre of porn, continually eliciting our attention into repetitive, fragmented drives. This technological exteriorization of know-how is accompanied by bureaucratic and expert exteriorization of knowledge, as the attention economy reformats the public discourse into short circuits of repetitive drives. The experts and pundits move in to claim their share of mass attention. Is it not surprising that the latest crop of liberal apologists support the marketplace of ideas with no sense of irony? The intellectual dark web parades the beaten cliches of free speech and the exchange of ideas, but they aggressively forget persistent historical and systemic problems that have already destroyed our public discourse decades, if not a century ago. These figures rarely, if ever, cite Jürgen Habermas's critique of the colonization of the public sphere, or pose the problem of the impotency of protests and public speech in today's society. Of course, I have a few guesses as to why this is. Most of the figures of the intellectual dark web are specialists tinkerers and experts that presume the reign of corporate and state bureaucracies of one sort or another, regardless of what the workers think of the issue. Public stupor is a symptom of the working class's muteness. And I was reading what Marx was writing about the corn laws in Britain, and he was writing about how he said that any industrial worker in Britain could understand and explain, be able to explain in the public, why the bourgeoisie wanted to repeal the corn laws. And we have to understand, Marx believed this even though most of the workers were illiterate. Now, of course, today we have much lower illiteracy rates than we did back then, though not as low as you might expect. And we have to ask, what is the role of a worker in a public discourse? So, just throwing that out there for now. So, these problems compose our research program. Let us review the problems. The primary problem is educating individuals via collectives, starting with small associations and building towards working class collectives. The next two problems are the dual problems of collective disindividuation. The first collective disindividuation that we must struggle against is the regression of the working class into interindividuality as isolated employees and consumers. The second collective disindividuation is the loss of know-how to technological and institutional automation. I end this essay with the question of responsibility to the working class. As a YouTube producer, I find that with every step I take in this media game, my responsibility to imagined future comrades is undermined by the total system. Yes, I have a responsibility to grow the audience and a healthy addiction to the slimy clearing channel, of course. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is the easy task, and that's already hard enough. The more difficult responsibility remains: training as many alienated workers as possible, including myself, to see like William Blake, critique like Karl Marx, and organize like Eugene V. Debs, as cliched as this may sound. A materialist education cannot remain at the level of propagating the right ideas or gaining a following. We must encourage workers to think and produce new forms of collective responsibility that give them new powers, new skills in social association outside of the production of capital. Fortunately, I see hopeful signs on the horizon. When Peterson said the new counterculture is to be useful, I sympathize with him absolutely. I do frequently inquire into the usefulness of my job. And I know there are millions of workers in the advanced capitalist countries who are having the exact same thoughts. How will we embody this problem? So that's the presentation. Any questions?
My main question is, will you run for political office?
All the politicians are reformists. They go to no.
Oh, if you run for political office.
No dual power strategy?
No. It's corruption.
No, what's that?
I already gave up on grad school. I'm not doing political office.
Do it.
To the
Communists should
stiffs.
run for president. President should run for communists.
Yeah.
Walking
yeah.
stiffs.
That's my slogan.
That's good.
Yeah. What's up?
Yes, am I correct in assuming that most of leftist history in this country is indeed organized labor history?
I think for the most part, either that or farmers.
That's fallen off the cultural radar
Yeah.
almost entirely.
Yeah. Well, I can sometimes sound like a workerist, like I think that the workers know something or they have the power to do anything. I don't necessarily think that. What I do think is that if you're going to have a transition to a post-capitalist situation, you can't do it without the workers. And frankly, I don't trust, a lot of us, we have some ties to university, most of us. Not all of us, but most of us, right? And additionally, like I wonder with Jordan Peterson's fan base, I know there are workers there, but most of the people of his fan base that I've talked to are like high-paid professionals, or they're trying to go into STEM fields. And so it's kind of like, do you really really want to trust like the upper part of like the professional classes, what could be called labor aristocracy, with this sort of like reorganization of working class issues? Do you want like this professional class to organize these mutual aid societies? Now, don't get me wrong, we do need them, but as long as workers lack agency and knowledge about the conditions of their situation, then it's going to fall back into a
Yes.
professionalized sort of
By
hierarchy.
default.
Yeah, and that will hook back up with the hierarchy of power of the capitalist state. I mean, the thing with the DSA is kind of like an empty container, but, well, I'm neutral about it because I don't know how its relation to the state yet.
Daniel Caruso says it was good.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, as an organizer and a union man myself, I have a
Cool.
naive question.
Uh-huh.
What type of educational interventions are you implementing to organize and educate working people?
We can't know. Here's the weird paradox of the slimy clearing group is, on the one hand, we have to research the immediate conditions of workers as they stand now, right? We have to know what are they doing in their leisure time, what is their actual work, where are they at, which sectors, is it in distribution, is it in production? That's one part, just how things stand now. But then there's a second and more paradoxical state. We have to research something that doesn't exist yet. We have to research what are the potentials for workers to reorganize mutual aid societies, which could produce new unions or new forms.
And
So I don't
presumably
know.
this entails some type of interaction.
Yeah.
People, working, that's.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I mean, I'm not going to lie. So, of our Slavic clearing collaborators, most of them have some college experience. We have a few that dropped out of college and work shitty service jobs. I have a college degree, but I don't have to go into this tokenism sort of. But you're right. Like, there needs to be some sort of discourse with workers for multiple reasons. And it's hard to cover all those. I mean, one, you want a worker to come to understand themselves as an interlocutor that has a set of reasons or motivations and that can organize with people who have college degrees, who have skills and knowledge that they don't have, but at the same time, workers have skills and knowledge that the professionals don't have who are college educated. Yeah, that's a great question.
So,
Oh,
I think he had his hand up first, but.
oh, hey Patrick, what's up?
so when you've discussed things like the attention economy
Mhm.
and some of the society spectacle and mediation of communication, part of me keeps returning to the thoughts laid out by Walter Benjamin in his work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility. And he brings up the fact that our communication has always been mediated. Communication is in some way necessitated by mediation. And as we go on, we've reached a point, like I'm being filmed right now, we've reached a point where mediation is basically part of our material conditions.
Yeah.
So looking forward, like, in some sense, I almost agree with Peterson when he says we need an online university. I just think that the things being taught need to be different than what he thinks.
Well,
So,
yeah.
so I guess if you take mediation and the things like the kind of paradoxes of like teaching on YouTube or something like that, like how do you think that the material conditions of our mediation could be changed?
Well, this is a very difficult point. When you say that we do need an online university, I would agree, because that's the state we're in. We're so alienated and like everything, there's so much social alienation in the sense of people are separated and they can't do things with other people. If they were to do something with other people, they wouldn't know what to do. And yeah, I have concerns about his content on the university too. But in addition, I have concerns about the forum. Now, Peterson did say he wanted the university to use the full breadth of interactivity. But as a former, computer science graphic interface designer, I know that interactivity just means toys. It doesn't mean much. It really doesn't. Now, of course, you're right. I'm not necessarily saying that we should eliminate alienation. I don't even know if that's possible. But we need an alienation in relation to a constituted subject, in relation to a collective subject. We have to be able to master alienation. So like xenofeminism, their manifesto is about like alienation is the work of our liberty. And I might have some problems with how ambiguously they define it, but we have to produce a subject that deals with the alienation. But we can't eliminate the alienation, especially under capitalism. But we might be able to form civil society subjectivities like organizations that can rework the alienation. Yeah, I'd like to talk more about that.
Elliot, did you have something?
You want to?
Oh yeah, I wanted to sort of, on the union question, what do you think of sort of umbrella unions like the IWW and their role in sort of organization?
It's really tricky. Like, I don't know, like, I'm still learning the history of the left, and I kind of wonder, do we think that we should be aiming towards the unions as they were? Should we be aiming towards, like, the general strike as a political tactic within a strategy, right? Is that what we should be aiming for? And we should remember that even in the heyday of unions in the United States, it was still not all the states. It's just a handful of states. This is a major problem. So we have to ask, like, should we even be aiming for that now, especially with the level of technology and alienation we have currently? So I'm looking at unions. I'm not dismissing them, but I'm also looking at mutual aid societies. I'm looking at like some of the Nick Cernisek and Alex Williams accelerationism and seeing if workers can adopt technology to form new mutual aid societies. I don't know. So umbrella organizations, I think we need more unions before we can have umbrella unions.
You brought up the aristocracy of labor, and I live in Seattle where Amazon is, headquartered, and I feel like there have been a few attempts by employees of Amazon or Microsoft to tell the billionaires that own those companies, we don't want you, for instance, to take a contract from the U.S. military to make drone warfare.
Yeah.
And like it doesn't stop it from happening, obviously. And it's like because of the way that those people are, whatever the golden handcuffs, like they're embedded in a society that's completely unaffordable if they like jeopardize that high-paying job. That I think that maybe we underestimate the possibility of reaching tech workers as a class,
Yes.
as that has a lot of bargaining power as a class.
Yes, yes.
It's overlooked.
Well, okay, there's multiple ways you can look at that. On the one hand, we have to realize that, of course, there's room for like redistributing politics, for like arguing for a higher wage. I mean, absolutely, we should be organized and ready to do that at a moment's notice. I want the workers to be organized like that, but at the same time, we have to realize that the tech sector is particularly strange because it's a rentier system, and they do have high profits, but it is in relation to state patents. And the United States, of course, having the world's largest military, they're pretty good at enforcing their patents around the world. So that's an interesting question. I have other collaborators who would be really interested in that particular question.
Yeah, it's more of just an idea, not a question even. It's just kind of like, are we overlooking the outreach to like, or like, I think maybe we're separated by a few digits of income, but, but like the motivations could be there for some of those workers.
Yeah, I understand that. We can talk about that more. Yeah, go ahead. She's been writing on it.
So I'm actually just curious kind of like what your definition of a worker is,
Yes.
like what kind of sectors you're appealing to here, because I mean, you said you're not, you sound like a workerist, but you're not, but that's the kind of crux of the question for me. Like what kind of educational, because it depends, the answer to that question will inform what kind of outreach you do.
Oh yeah.
And also the kind of education that you provide too, because I mean, is it just like construction workers and fast food workers? Like who's the audience here?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, the workers are not organized as a class politically, so they're going to have inter-class competition. So, for example, this is really funny. So, like, Oklahoma has really low-paid teachers in comparison to the national average, but they're still making higher than the average wage in Oklahoma, which is pretty bad. So it's like, the idea is, how do you produce a situation in which workers who do have competing interests in this or that situation, where you can realign their interests? And I don't know, I mean, we're still early in this research process, and I don't anticipate all workers to be the same at all. You know?
I'm just curious more about cultural and creative classes, since I think we seem to be possibly headed towards, are you guys all familiar with Four Futures, like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the kind of like, I don't know, cultural production as the main side of production, and like, so that, especially with automation as it is, right? So like, how do artists or writers or cultural creators play into this, like, notion
Well,
of work?
this is very difficult because like the arts markets and both local and international art markets and a lot of the cultural production, I mean, I'm still working this out, but it does seem like there's a sort of neoliberal governmentality in which artists are encouraged to enjoy their own productions, but they are not encouraged to enjoy collective productions. So what I mean by that is like, it's really easy for YouTubers to do their like lone individual thing and like create whatever videos they want at a whim, but they never really congeal that content creation into something that that is responsible to an audience, in the sense responsible to an audience that helps them reskill. Does that make sense? Kinda?
Yeah.
Like, you can waste a lot of time on YouTube. I don't want to say waste because it's your personal enjoyment,
Yeah, no,
but at the
I
same
get
time,
kind of what you're saying.
yeah, there's no collective enjoyment. Yeah.
Oh, well, did you want to
Oh.
ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. I have a few things. I guess like one thing sort of like got back to like the what is a worker question. Personally, I feel like it's something that is best thought of as like, rather than like a positive category, like a negative exception to like the bourgeoisie. Like, and specifically like the idea that like you know, and this is where like I guess I have some issues with like I try to talk about like the workers and the oppressed. Like I always sort of bring in that like the oppressed as well, because I feel like it can get a little bit like misleading or seem a little reductionist if you're just talking about, oh yeah, well these are the people whose labor is exploited. There are all sorts of like unemployed people, there are all sorts of like, you know, other sorts of like subject positions that, you know, are not, you know, are at the same time like not exploiting other people,
Right.
and are actually in a position where they are on the edge of themselves, at least on the edge of being
Right.
exploited. At that point, I feel like it's sort of like basically the people that we're uniting are like everyone who's not fucking caught in like the circle of disruptive exploitative drive. By the way, on the subject of imaginary mediation, Daniel Caruso said earlier that he trusts you because you have a better jacket than him, which I think is something to keep in mind. That's a good fucking jacket. That's a good jacket.
Yeah, I don't. With my question, I was more thinking of like so like disability theory, like and stuff like that, because there's a lot of people who can't work or like contribute productively.
Right. Yeah.
That
Well,
workers and would like exclude,
well,
but
let me back up a bit. So I'm not saying that only workers need to be educated and organized, but I am saying that if we want to start producing another revolutionary subject, we have to include workers.
Yes.
And how I see it is like the cultural classes, like tech workers, etc. They have, I mean, they're professionally encouraged to educate themselves. But then you have a whole swath of workers who are encouraged not to do so, that are encouraged just to ignore the fact that they have to work this or that service sector job, you know. So I'm not limiting it to workers, but I think our primary problem is figuring out how to produce that working class education, in addition to peasants in the third world and etc. Yeah. And petite bourgeois segments, like my parents, but no, I'm just kidding, not them. But like teachers and that sort of thing, you know. Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, the politics of vulnerability, like if you have a vulnerability, a lot of workers have the same vulnerability. So you can organize not necessarily along class lines, but along like, oh, I can't get health care, or I can't get this and that, right? Yeah. But I don't know what our time is.
Yeah, we're gonna try to wrap up this Q&A session around 9:55, start the next sessions by 10.
What time is it?
5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a lot more time than I thought we would. All right.
Yeah, we're running a little over, but that's okay.
Okay, that's it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of double down on Emily's statement about how do tech workers fit into this. Comes from a very selfish perspective. I am a tech worker. That's the industry that I work in.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And then Sammy's comment about how do we even define a worker, those seem to dovetail with each other.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think depending on our perspective, and you mentioned general strike a moment ago, And so that's another term that I would like to redefine or come to some notion of definition around, because it seems to me, as from the perspective of a tech worker, I've thought about Emily's comment quite a bit. Like, how would organization work? And there's seems to be no effort. I've talked to labor organizers about this. It feels like those folks are still sort of focused on the same group of government workers, or large sectors of our economy that, from my perspective, feel not really like workers anymore. I mean, the economics of our society have gotten to dystopian proportions, to the point that someone who's living paycheck to paycheck isn't really, like, the economics of their, like, a worker class that, Marxist theory could be applied to, seems to me, nope, like that, there's a complete disconnect there. And so if you want to sort of apply the theory in a practical manner, I think that the target of that maybe should be rethought. And so, for example, recalibrated, exactly. And I don't know that I'm correct in this, but if it was recalibrated towards, for example, a class of workers like the tech sector, for example, and the reason I go there is twofold. One, selfish reason, but secondly, because it seems to me that, at least, well, I almost said in American society, but no, globally, tech workers, and I'll go even more specifically, Silicon Valley, that's it. A very small regional area, and the bubble that those folks live in, folks that I know personally, right, wield all the power. So if you want to organize any group in any way to affect any kind of change, there has to be some latent power that can be galvanized, right? And I don't see that existing anywhere outside of Silicon Valley, to be perfectly honest.
Well, let's talk about that, because as we said earlier, Silicon Valley has a special relationship with the government. And the little minor revolts that have happened, Amazon, Google, senior engineers resigning because they don't like the sort of contracts that are being.
And to that, I would add, because I'm right in the middle of all that, so I think it's twofold. Just like philanthropy, it like creates a headline like, Amazon workers are good people, we didn't want this, but then you also can still do it. So it kind of creates one narrative that says one thing and does another.
Google employees getting rocks thrown at their bus on Mission Street in San Francisco and thinking, what am I doing wrong? I'm just trying to go to work, right? But the fissures in the system that began to appear, these folks their bubble is not a pure bubble anymore. That's my point.
Well, this is really interesting, because I'm really concerned about, like, as I said before, social alienation is a problem that produces technological solutions. So, for example, Murray Bookchin said the reason people don't go outside isn't because they're addicted to their TV. It's because if they went outside, they wouldn't know what to find. And so, as someone with a computer science degree and who's done some programming, I totally distrust us. But we should. And here's the question I want to ask. Do the workers have no say in how technology is developed? Because when you think about it, all this technology in Silicon Valley is being produced to solve either state problems, like for the CIA with Palantir, his UPS surveillance company name is.
If you need an overwhelming little data point of evidence that we are living in a dystopian future, Palantir Technologies is it.
Peter Thiel's the freak. But that's probably too nefarious of an example, but it's actually the mundane technologies that we should probably be more concerned by, like just social media in general has an insidious role. And I don't know what that means. I mean, the thing is, like, can workers articulate problems that can find technological solutions from tech worker allies? Because you can organize tech workers, and I think they should, to get higher paid, regardless of whether they're in a rentier economy or not. Either way, they should be getting more paid. I agree with that completely. But I also want to ask, like, what are the effects of their products for workers? And that's vague, but
it is vague because we're just beginning to ask those questions as a society, right? And we're asking them because we're beginning to see ill effects, right? So, and what's interesting about social media, as your example, is that you use the word insidious. It's insidious. the CIA, the Palantir examples, there's a Peter Thiel at the top of that who's talking to some other shadowy, contractor, right? And they're making sort of directed decisions. Social media, it's insidious. It's its own monster out there, just sort of like, directing itself, right? And affecting us.
It is our Frankenstein's monster.
Yes,
We are
yes.
it.
And tech workers themselves
We
are
are
beginning
it.
to pick up on that fact, so there's an opportunity.
Yeah, so we gotta wrap this session up, we gotta get our other sessions going, we'll start at 10, go to about 10:30.
I'd be happy to talk with any of you afterwards, of course.
I think that's.